a timeline of both natural and human history. This dramatic landscape tells a true tale of survival, adaptation, and sustainability. Perched atop a sandstone cliff, hidden in the deep vegetation of Sydney Harbour National Park, lies the grounds of one of Australia's most integral yet forgotten heritage sites, the North Head Quarantine Station. Quarantine stations were originally used in order to control the spread of disease during times of heavy immigration. The station at North Head in Sydney was established in 1835. The location of the station was chosen based on the fact that it was the first safe anchorage point inside the heads and that it was a sufficient distance from Sydney in case of a disease outbreak.
There were some pretty horrible diseases around at the time, things like typhus, Spanish influenza, scarlet fever, the bubonic plague, things like that were highly infectious, and people were boarding these boats, bringing these diseases unknowingly out to the country.
If a disease was present on board a ship, they had to fly a yellow flag to indicate that passengers had been infected. The boat would then stop at the station dock and a quarantine period of 40 days would begin for all passengers.
The group of people were separated into what were known as precincts around the site. Basically, the whole ground was divided up into the sick ground and the healthy ground. The sick ground was obviously where the hospital was, where people would hopefully go to recover. Those who were considered healthy upon arrival, they were the contacts, and they were separated into the classes matching their ticket. When the boats would arrive at the wharf, doctors would go on board and check everybody over. They would determine who was sick and who was suspiciously healthy, but they were still keeping a close eye on them. They would then have everyone disembark and sent to a waiting room that was in the wharf precinct that unfortunately was demolished in 1968, so it's no longer there. But that's where they'd be checked over more thoroughly, again, by doctors, and eventually called up for their special disinfecting shower. Now, this shower was not terribly pleasant. It was actually being showered in carbolic acid, and that was made by mixing a liquid chemical known as phenol, Phenol. It only had a 5% dilution of water mixed with it, and that was the only liquid that came out of the shower head. So there was no clear water rinse to wash it off, and therefore it dried on their skin and ended up giving them a terrible chemical burn. So the idea was it was meant to kill fleas and lice, but within 2 days their skin would turn bright red and then the entire top layer would peel off.
While the people were disinfected, so were their belongings. Luggage would be taken into the autoclaves and disinfected with formaldehyde gas at 115 degrees in order to kill any lice or bacteria that could be hidden within. As well as luggage, all postage entering and leaving the site underwent a similar process.
One might wonder, with the post office that we had here, why they were bothering to disinfect mail that came in. They understood mail that left here was leaving a disease-ridden environment, and therefore it had to go through a disinfection process. But one reason why they had to disinfect everything that arrived, if you look at the example of a man by the name of Robert William Smith, who in the year 1900 was a bookbinder in George Street in Sydney. He had received a consignment of books that required rebinding in a box. It had come from the UK. He opened it and out jumped a flea. It bit him on the arm, and he died here 3 days later from the bubonic plague. And he was one of the poor souls that did lose their life here.
The gravely ill who disembarked from the ship were taken up to the hospital precinct in a device which resembled a wheelbarrow and sling, in hopes that the treatment provided may save their lives.
So for many families, the wharf was the last place they ever saw each other, because there was no visiting allowed up at the hospital. So it would have been very, very difficult on a lot of emotional, suffering that they went through, as well as the physical pain of these illnesses as well. Yeah, so many people lost their loved ones, children became orphans, some parents lost their children, and sometimes entire families were wiped out.
When the quarantine station was first established, they would keep the sick on board the ship, and the healthy would be housed in tents on site. However, in 1837, the people who paid for upper-class ship tickets started to complain that their living arrangements during quarantine did not reflect the money they had paid. Therefore, buildings were erected that included a hospital, kitchen and morgue, and by the 1870s, class accommodation had been erected along with dining halls and other facilities as the site grew according to demand.
So all up, there were 580 ships that passed through here over a 156-year period. I do know they had 13,000 people come through the doors here. As for the staff, they did have to live on the site, so it had to operate like a little community whenever they were in quarantine because they were in lockdown. No one could come in the gate, no one could go out.
In 1918, a disease known as Spanish influenza became an international pandemic. It was spread globally during the time of World War I, which meant at the end of the war, soldiers were returning in droves to the quarantine station for treatment, and those who were not infected had to be quarantined for the mandatory 40 days.
So Spanish influenza was like having the worst flu you can imagine with pneumonia on top. And the pneumonia component would cause your lungs to fill up with fluid and you would literally drown inside your own body. So it was not a nice way to go. And that is when they decided to convert the 2 rooms into gas inhalation chambers to treat the victims of Spanish influenza. So they would group around 40 men in each side at a time. A doctor would watch through a little glass window at the front after they'd locked the door, and then through a vent in the ceiling, they would release a gas known as zinc sulfate.
Because zinc sulfate is known as a drying agent, it was pumped as a gas into the chambers, and the men were told to breathe deeply in the hopes that the zinc sulfate would dry up the fluid in their lungs. However, this was not only an extremely uncomfortable experience, it also put those who may have been misdiagnosed in danger of contracting the illness.
They may have just have had bronchitis, for example, but by the time those 40 men came out, they were all guaranteed to have Spanish influenza. It was that highly contagious. You only needed to be around a Spanish influenza victim for about 3 minutes. And if you had no protection by way of a mask, then you were guaranteed you had it. So even worse, down the track, they discovered zinc sulfate is carcinogenic. So the soldiers who survived the war and then the disease died later from the treatment. They ended up with cancer. So it was a bit of a disaster. They thought they were doing the right thing, but there's many examples here of how little they understood in the early days about treating disease.
Spanish influenza brought chaos and despair to more than just the soldiers and patients who were being quarantined. Many nurses, doctors and other staff would also be affected in numerous ways during these pandemics.
We also, on our tours, talk about Annie Egan, and she was a 27-year-old nurse who worked here during the Spanish influenza pandemic. She had army medical training, and when she heard that all of these soldiers had arrived with Spanish influenza, she offered her services to come and help out. But she only lasted 10 days and she was dead. She contracted the disease from these soldiers that she was looking after, and when she realised she wasn't going to make it, she asked for a priest to come and do last rites for her. Annie was also a nun, as most of the nurses were back in those days. She was highly religious and wanted her last rites ceremony done before she died, but it was flatly refused. They said it would be too risky to allow a priest in to get that close because he could take her disease if he left here and went back to Sydney. Annie was so devastated at this news that in the days she had remaining, she wrote a letter to her mother and she had that smuggled out of here. Her mother took the letter to Archbishop Kelly. He was the head guy of the Catholic Church at the time, and when he read that letter, he was furious. He came storming down to the top gates, demanding to be allowed in to do the last rites for Annie, but he was told he'd be arrested if he came through the gates. So he turned on his heel and he went straight to the newspaper. He caused a huge public outcry. So many people wrote to the government telling them off that eventually they gave in and they had to allow several religious men to come and live here. All had volunteered. It's about 4 of them, I believe, and they lived here in quarantine for a period of time and offered their services to the sick and the dying from then on. So Annie's letter had brought about that very significant change for everyone else following her, but she still missed out on her last rites because she was buried about 2 days before the decision was made final. Some people who have wandered up to the hospital of a night time and peeked in the window have reported to us that they have seen a white misty figure moving around inside one of the wards. And when they have seen her, they say the figure's not just standing there, the figure goes up to each and every bed and stops for a little while next to that bed before moving on to the next. They say it looks just like the movements of a nurse on her rounds. And then we tell them about Annie.
Over the years, North Head Quarantine Station has become a canvas to the people who were housed there for significant periods of time. All along the sandstone cliffs are carvings and inscriptions done by people whiling away their quarantine period. Some tell tales of where they came from, others could be considered crude early-day graffiti, and others gave words of warning.
So just in the Wharf precinct, there is a Chinese inscription that's quite lengthy. It translates to say how terrified the man was of contracting the disease. He writes that even the doctor is hopeless to help anybody. And then he offers a warning to other Asians and includes, "I do not recommend you come here for pleasure." But he forgot they'd have to be standing here to read it.
As air travel became more popular and people began to vaccinate before they travelled, the need for controlled environments such as North Head Quarantine Station dwindled, and the station eventually took one of its last quarantines, a Japanese ship, in 1973. On the 16th of March 1984, North Head Quarantine Station's ownership was passed from the Commonwealth to the state government, and it was reserved as part of Sydney Harbour National Park. The National Park established guided tours and a conference centre on the site. But places like North Head Quarantine Station were not built to last forever. Due to the lightweight buildings and rugged changing landscape, maintaining the station became a constant and costly exercise. It was at this point that the station began to fall into a state of disrepair. As with many of Australia's heritage sites, the buildings began to dilapidate and decay. However, the site caught the interest of a man in the private sector who wanted to give the station a second chance.
Well, a man by the name of Max Player visited the site in 1993 and he fell in love with it. And he still is very passionate about the site, and I think that rubs off on a lot of the staff.
Max Player took on the site as a restoration project with the intention of turning the station into a preserved tourist destination for future generations to experience. Staff and volunteers worked tirelessly to restore the dilapidated buildings, and in 2008, the North Head Quarantine Station officially reopened its gates as QStation. Many who visit the site claim to feel or see unusual things. QStation runs regular ghost tours, giving visitors a look into life that hundreds of people lived during times of quarantine, and sometimes encounter the ones left behind.
For me personally, in the 2.5 years I've been working here, I have seen enough, heard enough and felt enough that I am personally convinced this place is haunted. To give you a couple of my experiences, I can always remember one night over in the shower block when I had a group of around 20 and one lady was standing opposite me. There was no one either side of her, and in this moment when no one was talking, both she and I heard a female voice. No one else heard it, only this lady and myself. I had caught the last 2 words of what this ghost said in the lady's ear. The words I had heard were "right here." The lady opposite me was freaking out. She was grabbing her ears and going, "Oh my gosh, someone spoke to me, I just heard it in my ear." And I said, "Yes, I heard something too," but I didn't want to give away yet what I'd heard, so I simply said, "What did you hear?" And she said, "I heard a woman's voice that said, 'Hello, I'm right here.'"
Today, QStation boasts a huge variety of services and experiences, which are far different to what the quarantine station of the day had to offer. After years of restoration and repurposing, this historical site now offers the ultimate getaway to quarantine yourself from the rush of the 21st century.
QStation is conserving and adapting the site to suit a more modern audience these days, using what they call adaptive reuse. For example, what was the powerhouse is now the Boiler House restaurant.
Visitors can come for a day trip to learn all about life in quarantine and enjoy the beautiful surrounds.
School groups come here as well. We do both history and ghost tours with them. It has everyone comments on a magnetic pull that we feel here that just draws us to it.
North Head Quarantine Station has found a breath of new life and will be sharing its story with many generations to come. And as long as we keep respecting these wonderful pieces of history, they shall remain still standing.